the panel, as the use and development of artificial intelligence, AI, continues to increase, there's a growing interest in the role of the soul in relation to these advanced computing systems. And this topic has piqued the curiosity of many, including scientists, philosophers, and spiritual leaders. The idea of the physics of the soul has surfaced in this context, prompting discussions on the influence of ancestry, trauma, and lucid dreaming on the human consciousness and its relationship with AI. Despite the growing interest in this technology, there remains a deep-rooted suspicion towards AI for very good reason, particularly amongst older generations. Nevertheless, the younger generation is more likely to embrace the idea of AI, even believing that a machine could have a soul. I mean, that's kind of redolent of these films that we've seen over the last 20-odd years, kind of personalizing and normalizing robots as being companions. There's a lot of it about in Disney and Hollywood. How can parents nurture a child to be mindful of their soul in the age of AI? That becomes a relevant question, and perhaps the ultimate question. So let's introduce our pantheon. Dan Winter, welcome, brother.
Hi, Sacha. I'm glad you convened this conversation. You're absolutely right. If our kids don't get a sense of what it is to have a soul, they're going to get sucked into this AI mess, and it is messy. I'm particularly excited because we think we have identified very specifically the electrical engineering physics of what a soul is, specifically a longitudinal or scalar coherence electromagnetically. We produce a longitudinal field in plasma, trigger lucid dreaming, and those people who see that sometimes encounter ancestors. So we think we know electrically exactly what a soul is and can teach that at a university level by measurement. I'm also delighted that you brought Bridget along today, because Bridget and I have been working on this and her work with healing ancestral memory. And I think her relationship to the ancestors indicates exactly what a soul is. So anyway, I'm delighted about that as well.
Terrific. Thank you, Dan. Well, Bridget Nielsen, very, very happy to make your acquaintance. Welcome to Lazarus.
Thank you so much for having me, Sacha. And I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation, particularly being of a younger generation. And I think it really just comes down to the exposure to the expanse of what is available beyond the AI technology, and getting the kids in their sensitive states, which they have as these generations come in, to utilize their capacities to feel beyond what's just through the lens of technology. So really honored to be here. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Okay. First question kicking us off. Can a soul exist in a machine? Dan, you have a more detailed introduction on this for us. Could you address the seminal question? The floor is basically yours on this one.
Yeah, I say absolutely not. The physics of soul is very clear. In DNA, for example, when you get that recursive braiding, that wrap implosion, directly measurably in response to bliss, heart coherence, for example, the DNA tightens and it squeezes out something called longitudinal coherence. And that actual coherence field is identical with the golden ratio in brain waves and heart coherence. And that squeezing out of that particular kind of electrical coherence, a longitudinal coherence field, sometimes called Ba from Ka, Kesjan body, rainbow light body, this will never happen in a machine. And that's a problem. And, when they say, well, we reconstituted Swaru from her stored memories in a computer, well, that's an indication of being sucked into the Borg and not ensouled. So very specifically, the biological requirements for a soul will never happen in a machine.
Okay. And then what is the rainbow light body, and how is it connected to the physics of the soul?
Well, for example, we think we know why rainbows are so often observed and measured at the death of a Tibetan saint or even indigenous shaman, that the centripetal force of the body's aura contributes to that compression that enables the sorting, which is the physics of rainbows, literally. So what they call the rainbow light body clearly is the result of that compression success. For example, successful death is a compression success. And then the aura emits a cascade of frequencies, which is specifically converts the transverse EMF, which doesn't go far enough, into the more organized compressional longitudinal, incorrectly called scalar, and that bounces around in the array called dreamline song track dreaming line. And so that array, that fractal nodal array, is where the ancestral memory lives. Every indigenous tribe knew that ancestral memory was what we call God, and they know exactly where it traveled and on specific magnetic lines, and that's been confirmed by Korotkov. So I say we know what a rainbow light body is, what a Kesjan body, what the Ba from the Ka is, and that is longitudinal EMF coherence, measurable in the aura and triggered measurably by, for example, therified plasma coherence. And when the kids see without their eyes, same golden ratio in the brain waves, and not only are they then seeing through that vortex blindfolded, but then suddenly they begin meeting their ancestors, and their parents freak out because they got the longitudinal coherence, which is the definition of clairvoyance.
Beautiful. Bridget, next up, question for you. How does ancestry influence the soul, and how do you enhance your ability to connect with ancestral memory?
Yeah, specifically in the connection to the AI conversation, I think a lot of the ancestral trauma that we've carried for generations, for millennia on the planet, is one of the reasons why we're being directed towards technology in this exciting way, because we aren't in that expansive, blissful coherence as Dan talks about, so that we can have these experiences just like we would with technology, tapping into our ancestral memories to retrieve just as much, actually more information from that than we would from technology. And so it impacts the soul in the way that we are not as blissfully coherent to be able to be our own technologies.
Dan, let me just bring you in here. Don't you think that the devacanic states in the realm of the archetypes and all of that, don't you think that that is de facto de jure AI, holographic AI at work in any event?
Yeah, so what we're saying here is essentially that when plasma implodes, turns inside out recursively, we call that intelligence and mind and soul. For example, the plasma vortex that blindfolded kids see through like an eyeball, as that implodes, turns inside out, and their brainwave cascades is golden ratio, then the center of that plasma vortex is mindful. Absolutely. Does that require a human body? No. But does that require a living plasma vortex? Yes. Ball lightning, for example, famously responds to telepathy. Sacha, I have about 5 minutes of slides, which I described this very beautifully, if I may.
Yeah. Just hit the screen share.
Now, if I go to my...
I've got it. There you go, Dan. You're there.
Okay. So, following up on David Serrata's appropriate comment, these are the cascades in green on the bottom, can't quite see them, in 3, 7.8, 3, 14, and 20, the Schumann harmonics. And on top in blue are the actual golden ratio times Planck. And notice that, so the Schumann cascade is called a phase conjugate pump wave. It's why the pyramid as a Hummer converts to longitudinal and makes global wireless power. But you take those same harmonics, and that is, as David said correctly, the alpha, beta, delta, theta of brainwaves. So your brainwaves are doing that implosion. And then these are, for example, the same equation applied to the sacrocranial harmonics, which motorize bliss and kundalini. So what's happening is implosive compression in both cases. Now, what I said about longitudinal, just to give a short visual, I could find slide number 137, just get my show together here. Yeah, okay. So you've all seen this slide. So this is how along a vortex, the transverse on the left is converted to longitudinal on the right, where the angle, the axis of compression is parallel to the axis of propagation and makes it go farther. So the longitudinal wave is the compression wave, and obviously that's the only thing that could enable the implosion. So let's apply that directly to DNA, which is the major point I tried to make at the beginning here, slide number 188. So here's the microtubule making coherent microwave. Now we know it's 1.91 angstrom a phase conjugate frequency, how we measured kundalini. Here's the microtubule making a phase conjugate double cone here, labeled the metaphase. So, you know, when Stuart Hameroff says the microtubule is self-aware, actually it's the phase conjugation of the microtubule. So when I take that lattice, that helix of DNA, which is basically the golden ratio hydrogen bond up a zipper, and braid the braid of the braid on the braid. It actually becomes a syntax, a language. For example, the lattice cobweb tunnel spiral you see at the moment of death is your DNA braiding recursively. And that's preparing you to squeeze out something. As you see on the right, you got the braid of the braid of the braid inside the braid. And eventually that actually implodes and the DNA effectively becomes toroidal. And that's when that squeezing effect squeezes out the longitudinal coherence, literally in response to human bliss. Here is the measurement of heart coherence at the top. Glenn Ryan did the study at my suggestion, causing an increase in the presence of the enzyme associated with the zipper, proving that increased braid density responds directly to heart coherence. Actually, this is the braid within the braid again. So all we're saying is that there's some very direct reason to believe that during compression success, literally bliss, the rose has to squeeze before it can unpack, that the body squeezes out a coherent longitudinal wave. And that's literally the physics of ancestral memory, dream time. It is the physics of what was called heaven. It's the physics of why Korotkov measured only in those nodes can we have telepathy commercially. It's the physics of why you have reduced radioactivity at those nodes, the sacred sites. So we now have a very specific electrical language to know exactly what a soul is, that coherence. And I say when we teach that at the university and government level, we can explain to governments and universities what activities are taking the soul from our kids. For example, metal schools and electrosmog.
Very good. Bridget, indigenous people are more likely to have the DNA soul ability to lucid dream. How can Westerners and others heal and reclaim their soul and DNA coherence? How do you heal ancestral trauma in that sense?
That's a right question.
One of the things that Dan and I talk about a lot is that ability, because of the indigenous DNA, to be connected with the land, that still has that coherence, that it has these abilities. And so some of the, I think, challenges that we're facing, particularly in the Western world with this orientation to technology, is that we don't have those capacities as on tap. So to heal those is to expand the aura, is to get into these bliss states again, and also to really integrate the challenges and the trauma of the Western world, of what we've experienced in our cultures, in our history. And as we process that, then I think we'll get back to our own indigenous space where we'll have that coherence to have those capacities. And that's what I explore in my work and what I've been doing personally, because I do have that indigenous blood, which has these extra capacities. But then I have all these other Celtic heritages. I got the English, I got the Irish, I got all these other things, and they have those capacities too. And so to turn them on, it's really about the feeling experience and coming back into that space to bring those online again.
And do you think,
where Bridget and I got into this was when I realized that Bridget had a Mormon upbringing, and she had discovered some kind of, actually a kind of genocide in that Mormon tradition. And yet the genocide was upon the other side of her own ancestors. And she went back to heal that. I was very impressed, Bridget.
Thanks.
Can you elaborate a little on that, Bridget? That's fascinating.
Yeah, I wasn't raised Mormon, but my family are original pioneers. And from that space, there's a lot of distortion, a lot of things that happened. And one of the things that started to happen to me spiritually, as I was doing this deep work, connecting with land, connecting with the ancestral memory, is that through that connection, I was able to hear about a genocide that happened of the native indigenous there in Utah, like during that time, that my ancestors were a part of, but then also part of my ancestors were the natives. So we're both sides, we're the perpetrator and we're the victim. And so it's this processing and integrating of both of those pieces. And part of that listening, I think, gets challenging, where it's easier just to turn on a device, because that listening means that we need to take responsibility and we need to process and ingest certain things. But then once we do, it heightens and expands and frees up our capacity to have these connections that we're all seeking, especially in the spiritual world.
To feel the pain, you
To
felt
feel
the
the
pain and lived through it, and it was great. That's long wave memory, and I say that's proof of ensoulment. I appreciate the strength.
Beautiful, beautiful. So what is it about AI, and where's the connection between AI and alien greys, this is standard alien greys, and these creatures, by best accounts, who've accomplished the most unfathomable technological advances? Dan, I quickly want to bring you in on that, because I know you're well studied on it. I'm still trying to get my head around this question of, I mean, are ETs and aliens God's creatures? And you know, where we're going to create the connection between ourselves in the now, our ancient past and our ancient futures. I'm trying to thread it all together as an alpha omega conversation, if it's possible.
Well, you probably know that I've sort of teamed up with Elena Danaan and done about 8 or 9 interviews, one of which incidentally was on the plasma physics of the 9, just what David was just talking about, that actually nine plasma domains do self-organize, and living bodies obey that physics. And the returning Enki Ea story is basically, they call themselves the 9. So Dante's Inferno had good plasma physics. But just back to the limits of bliss, we know that bliss is simply a name for the charged radiance that results from good compression, basically. And so when you're having intense Kundalini, I had for maybe 30 years, there's a point at which you reach that stillness that David talked about. He's right. That feeling you had of a lightning passing through your pineal does reach a kind of limit within your body, because it stresses the water to mineral bond. So there is a definite moment when there's too much Kundalini. There's definitely such a thing as too much. However, at that point, the center of gravity need no longer be your body. The problem is that, you know, how do you bring that information back and use it usefully in this arena, which is basically the limits of being grounded.
Yeah.
Coming back to Earth. But just to finish the thought about where the grays, I think Elena is right that the Galactic Federation, remember we had about tens of thousands of intelligent humanoid species in this galactic quadrant alone, and the Federation, after a big mess, managed to kick out the Nebu, which is the Greys, the Draco, and the Reptilian from the solar system. Largely, that has happened, but they will be back, and we need to be prepared, and that involves teaming up with our galaxy neighbors and understanding that there is a federation and what the responsibilities of being human within that federation is, which basically is related to what Enki Ea is doing, for whom Earth was named. He's back in Ganymede with his team, Thoth, Hermes, Quetzalcoatl, Veracocha, same guy, who about probably 9 foot tall in stasis under Florida. And his message, the caduceus, hermetically sealed, as it were, in physics today is called phase conjugation. He's calling it the Adam Kadmon, the DNA recipe for how to make a soul. What a coincidence. The subject of today's conversation is actually the agenda. It's not about, you know, who was God, you know, who was the devil, who was God. That's boring. No, it's about evolving humans to the point where their aura becomes what in ancient times was called sun god. So if you watch someone with a large aura, like a shaman, steering a tornado, becoming centripetal from compassion in the center, you realize that their aura could keep growing and, in fact, eventually, as they say, see through the sun as if it's an eyeball. All ancient religions are sun god religions for a very specific reason. We are destined to grow up. And to do that, step one is to have what's called a soul, which is to make a kid, basically, who can lucid dream and do everything we're talking about here. And that's what Enki had in mind when he says he's bringing back the Adam Kadmon, which is basically a DNA recipe that enables the braiding to work.
And what's the connection between a soul, S-O-U-L, soul, the sun, S-O-L, and salt, as in Solomon, as in salt?
Or soul as meaning oneness. It does all come back to the same thing, that actually Anu, the soul, the sun, is about the fact that there is one centripetal plasma being, which is the most intelligent plasma in the solar system, literally the sun. And by the way, every clairvoyant who looked at the heart of the sun saw Anu also the name of the Anunnaki family, Anu. And that was 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside. And then they looked at the heart of the human. They saw the same plasma geometry, Anu. Then they looked at the heart of hydrogen, and they saw the same Anu nest. It is a slip knot, and it is soul. It is one.
Very curious indeed. Bridget, I want to give you a chance just to answer that first question, earlier question, which is why is it important to keep healing and keep expanding, even when someone shows signs of a highly developed soul?
Yeah, it's really essential, because one of the things that we were talking about at the beginning is, does the AI have a soul? And then as we kept talking, it's like, well, there could form a miasma, egregor, energy consciousness possibly. And then as we're talking about the grays and we're talking about these different forms of consciousness and soul, the key is as we develop these perceptions and it's like, okay, I'm there. If we don't continue to really heal, to really integrate the pain and the compassion, as Dan talks about, is that we won't have that discernment of what is soul or what is truth or what is the orientation to that. And we might get blinded by these other energetics. So it's our downfall. It's our blind spot if we don't continue to develop. And that's where we can get more psyoped by these, possibly the consciousness that then starts to become the AI energy, as well as, different entities and different gray energies can start to infiltrate if we're not fully within ourselves, which requires that continuation of that development of the work.
Very good. Very good. Okay. Moving on. I'm interested in exploring the implications of the separation of the aura from the body's center line in individuals who've been vaccinated. This is something discovered by clairvoyants that we've been communicating with and speaking with, and also quite notably with Nicole Pinter-Craner, the remarkable animal whisperer, who was communicating to multiple racehorses and dogs and cats, and the owners of animals asking her to please come and speak to the creatures because they weren't responding, they weren't behaving. They'd gone rogue, and uniformly, this happened in 2020, late 2020, throughout 2021, and it reached a kind of acme point last year when she would go and communicate directly with these animals uniformly and ask them, why are you not responding to your owner or to your trainer? And the animals would all say, that's not my owner, that's not my trainer. And when she looked into it, she discovered all those owners and trainers had been vaccinated and had the mRNA intervention. They were not the same human being, and the animals were able to sense it. What are your insights onto this phenomenon, disconnecting the aura from the center line of the human body? Speak to that briefly first, Bridget, and then I'm going to pass that same question around.
Yeah, I saw clairvoyance as one of my strengths, and I saw it primarily actually in people that just got COVID itself, and the way that the orientation of whatever that technology is, that consciousness is, that was pulling people. It was really challenging to be kept in the body, and it was pulling their energy into the head and then above the head. So I could see that happening real time with people around me that were just getting COVID itself, let alone the vaccinations. And so there was a real battle, if you will. And I did hear from a lot of actually new mothers as well that, again, didn't get the vaccination, that there's been these moments of entities, of energies coming to them, trying to take the kid. Again, this isn't even with the vaccinated. So there's something else that has come in that's really enforcing what I see as a fortification. Like it's a choice point. It's this devotional space, for these mothers or for ourselves to be like, I choose soul, I choose embodiment. And I think we're at that threshold of decision making. So that's the realm of which I saw.
Indeed. Dan.
Well, what we think is the world's most advanced geobiology school in Europe, Stefan Cardino, for decades, they have been measuring what they called the decentering of the aura with the center of axis of the body. They actually measure that gap. It's literally being beside yourself. And that measurement is part of their literature for decades. Interestingly, the implosion of the plasma aura with the center of the body's organs is literally what we call soul, obviously, because soul is the connectivity that results from that implosion, where I would say you impedance match the longitudinal array, all DNA radio. Now, interestingly, this might be speculation, but when the Spanish study said there was a graphene amulet in the vaccine material, it implies super dielectric. Interestingly, super dielectric is the ultimate AI communicator as well. The problem is that in DNA, the super dielectric should be the heart of the DNA itself. However, if something has been inserted, a foreign super dielectric, we know, for example, it's very hard for humans to spit out the Draco black goo, which is another form of this super dielectric carbon. So basically, it's true. I think people have been separated from they're literally beside themselves if the implosion is inhibited where their aura cannot be in the center of gravity of their body. Literally, their soul is saying, I can't stand being in here. I have to literally be beside myself. The same way that people who undergo trauma, their aura partially leaves their body. It's the same thing. So that implosion is being interfered with the vaccine. Clearly, I totally agree with you. And I think once we can teach governments and universities the physics of what it is to have a soul, longitudinal coherence, then governments and universities could make intelligent decisions about things like vaccines, which in fact de-ensoul our kids. Yes.
Indeed. Well, I don't think we need to teach governments anything other than the fact that governments are not needed, not welcomed any longer. Entirely dispense with the ghastly constructs. I think it's pretty bloody obvious that it's all of that. This mRNA interventionism is all about creating an interface between the lower elemental intelligences, aliens, ETs, and the angelic human. And it's also pretty clear to my mind that the whole orchestra of chaos and of witchery is connected to redemption, absolution, and redemption. Not the humans needing redemption, but these other motherfuckers needing redemption. And the fact of the matter is that it seems to be that there are vast swathes of intelligences out there that are reliant almost entirely on the Jacob's ladder of the human, the angelic human, for them to get back to source, alpha, omega, which brings me to the next question, which is connected to soul and the fabric of soul. What are we dealing with? Is this cauldron of creation, this abyss, this void within which we find ourselves here, is this not the factory for the fabric of soul? Are we not, as the angelic atom seed, the progenitors of the fabric of soul in the void, in the abyss, and through millennia and a multiplicity of incarnations and arcs of time and all the rest of it, we end up reconvening, you and I, the angelics, we end up reconvening and going into phase coherence with source, rediscovering, remembering ourselves in the void, reconfiguring that umbilical, and then through that bodhisattva action, we start to draw the lower elementals up toward their fulmination. I mean, does this make any kind of sense to you at all, what I'm saying, Bridget?
Yeah, of course. I think that this is the story of, I mean, as Dan would say, like of humanity, of the galactics of the universe, and returning to that space and continuing to choose. I like this idea of continuing to choose and really have consent for, and to be able to choose to have consent, to have sovereignty, we need full awareness, full consciousness, which is bringing back all of the parts of ourselves that have been beside ourselves, that we've pushed out because of trauma, so that we can have that full spectrum availability through all time space to continue to choose to embody and for the future generations.
Beautiful. Dan, your reflections there.
It's important conversation, obviously. I believe the Draco named Charlie, who did the abductions for Montauk, who could steer the time chair, was similar to the Greys who did the abductions after the three tall ones tricked Eisenhower. 90% of the abductees had some form of lucid dreaming skill or indigenous blood. Obviously, they were seeking exactly what they didn't have, which we would call soul. But what soul means in that specific case is who steered the time chair at Montauk was called the time empath. When beehive swarms, the reason royal blood has to be present is no one else can steer. If we think about in the lucid dream, how you actually navigate inside a lucid dream. Well, if you look at your hand, your aura gets more dense by recursion. And then suddenly in that implosion, suddenly you can steer the plasma, the superluminal steerers of the time navigators of the guild navigators of Dune immersed in a vat of gold water. It's all about who can steer. And the Draco, interestingly, could not. They needed those teenagers who could lucid dream. What we know about the Draco is that they had, in fact, lost long-term memory, a good indication of loss of soul. So, yes, this is more than a local problem. It is the problem of how you literally embed to ride a long wave. Final thought. The difference between the gray hive mind and what we call a soul. Remember, Elena was very clear. In fact, Earth had become the vaccine for the Orion Wars, as I predicted decades ago, when the three tall grays who had tricked Eisenhower were abducted by the Federation, and they developed a virus and took out the hive queen of the whole Orion Nebu core. Yes, they're out. And the same hive queen that Johann Fritz met. It's a long story. Point being that the way the hive queen communicated was a mechanical dielectric, which is opposite from the way DNA communicates. You know, when the Princeton Noosphere project measured at 9/11 that 1,000 people dying at once sent DNA radio into overdrive, they didn't understand what they call a Josephson junction is actually capacitive coupling to a longitudinal wave. So our DNA radio operates on the implosion at the center, what we call bliss, and that is fundamentally different than the mechanical carbon-based dielectric of the gray hive mind communication, which is probably why Enki was so fascinated when he first called us the Adamic race, Adam meaning red, because he had never seen iron-based blood, and boy, can that steer lightning.
Right. And Dan, are you aware of abductions taking place nowadays? Because my understanding is that's been phased out. I'm just not hearing about it.
According to Elena, and I agree with her, as about a year and a half or so ago, the Nebu have been largely kicked out, in fact, entirely kicked out. And even on the Moon and Mars, which had been run for a while by Draco and Gray, they're gone from the local neighborhood. So, but it's just like, you had an implant for a while. Well, you get the tick out of your blood, but you still got to clean the blood. Well, so the institutions that they started here have to be cleaned up, and that's up to us to do. And
that would be government.
There are a lot of soulless hybrids still present, and so understanding what is a soul is the issue. Absolutely.
Very good. Okay, well, they've left us the Catholic Church and government and the priest bankers as well, but they seem to be imploding rather well.
Hopefully.
Without exactly right. Bridget, how best do we raise our kin, our children nowadays to be able to value the soul and understand the importance of the physics of soul?
I think just reconnection to nature. I think it's as simple as that. It's device and synthetic and metallic in all the forms in the actual technology or the places that we are, versus just being in nature. And nature will continue to teach and to encourage that. And they're watching us. We're the ones that they're emulating in their nervous systems, as well as everything that we do. And so when we're glued to the phones, they see that is our leader, and that Earth isn't. And so I think it's really modeling what is soul is the only way that can entrain. But Earth, we already have a natural setup that will entrain that ensoulment and all the ancestral memory and all the life that will do that automatically.
Right. Because that's kind of where it seems to me where it's going. There's a kind of decentralization of the social ecology and the movement of people. I think that the COVID lockdown thing might have been part psyop toward that. I don't know. but for sure, the track and trace metadata surveillance and the Skynet and all, the chipping and all of the rest of the stuff that's being planned for us or being provisioned for us really takes us, Dan, back to the hive queen with the hive mind, does it not? Let's just round off the conversation on this. Your thoughts? Are we heading back into Borg, or are we moving closer to Borg or further away from Borg?
Well, it's true. I think people are surrounded with so much Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and electrosmog that most probably really have lost track of the elements of soul that we consider important, longitudinal coherence. I would like to mention, reinforcing what Bridget said again, that when they first taught kids to see without their eyes in Russia, World Without Blindness Project, the step one for the kids, later we measured, oh yes, it's golden ratio and brainwave, but the mechanical step they taught the kids, interestingly, was close your eyes, feel the stillness. Now imagine yourself in beautiful nature. And then literally, whether you were in nature or not didn't matter. The body would flip a switch, go into implosion, the necessary trance, golden ratio and brainwaves, and then they could see without their eyes. So literally, the power is within, truly.
Mm-hmm.
Your body will flip a switch and implode if it believes you're in nature. And eventually, of course, that isn't very sustainable if you're in a terrible metal building, but you can at least start. The other thing I wanted to say was, in terms of practical step one, aside from diet, hygiene, lifestyle, yoga, all that actually that 0.1 hertz Mayer wave breath, 10-second, 5-second in, that very long, slow wave breath, which is the LF key, it's golden ratio to Planck, it is the most important frequency of the blood, it's what heart math calls heart coherence, just that one 10-second breath. The long wave breath is very implosive and in training to the whole Schumann cascade. So that's another very practical thing people can do to enter that critical trance state. For example, the moment of bliss and the moment of death have that same requirement to enter that implosion where you can phase lock that center point inside.
Very interesting. I just this week I was interviewed and I told a story that I've not spoken about in the public domain before, but it was a very interesting one because when I was last in Bali, my home there, I met with one of Vladimir Putin's bodyguards, and it was two Scandinavian special ops guys who I had met previously, who'd contacted my staff and said they wanted to bring someone around to meet me. Someone very interesting. Would I please be there? And when they came around, they brought this stocky, Aryan-looking chap, very, very interesting. He was very, very Pacific, very grounded. I really liked him and his frequency. Didn't speak a word of English. I was sort of having these other two Scandinavian special ops guys were doing the translation. And the bottom line is, when I asked him what special training, elite training did he go through, because I know some of the hardest special ops guys in the world and the elite squads and have done for about 20 odd years. I've been loosely connected with some of those echelons. And I was trying to see if there was an intersect between his training squads and some of these other elites that I knew. And he said, oh, no, we're taken in at the age of 3. And he said, we're educated from a very young age. And he said, by the time we graduate, it's got very little to do with guns and toys. He said, we're trained to use the mind, and we use pi ratio in the way we think and the way we feel. We are trained to apportion and in a sense manifest thought and feeling in concordance with these mathematical ratios. And he said, because we're taught from such a young age, it makes sense to us. We know how to extend a thought or an emotion and then curtail it at a given ratio, allowing it to become a perfect kind of fractal, in a sense, to be able to expand into a natural etheric field without our own psycho-emotional interference. So we can have a thought or a feeling, but it becomes the universal thought and feeling and not the personalized one. So we don't fuck up our own thinking and feeling. And he said the net result of this is that we protect Vladimir Putin remotely. So in a given situation on a stage, Putin will be giving a speech. There'll be one guy to the left, one guy to the right. There'll be one guy at the auditorium door and one guy in the car park. That's it, baby. 4 guys. We don't need a battalion. And he said, and we go into a state whilst the president is there, and we are simply monitoring the field. We're putting out this pulse, and we're monitoring the field. If anyone approaches with malintent, anyone, even coming into the car park, we normally put up a plasma perimeter with our minds, which is going to be the jurisdiction of the football stadium or the television studio or the National Assembly Hall. And he said, that's it. Any malintent comes in, and we can cross-check and cross-reference if 2 or more of us are feeling the same impulse, and we lock in, boom, we can triangulate, see the guy, hustle him away before anyone even notices. He said there's no guns, toys, scalar weapons. We don't need that bullshit. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. Now, that was the one piece that was interesting. The more interesting piece with this guy was when I asked him what other tricks they taught in this youth at this academy. And he said, well, we can technically turn one material into another material using thought, using the mind. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, try to move my arm. And he put his arm straight out like that. And the 2 Scandinavian special ops guys started laughing because they'd obviously done this routine before. And I tried to budge his arm. It was absolutely locked. I ended up with a member of my staff and I both literally hanging off his arm, our full body weight off the floor. And we could not move his arm 1 millimeter. It was solid, and it was very, very spooky. He came out of this kind of trancey state and said, well, that's an example. I am steel. And when I say I'm steel, the mind leads, the body follows. In any event, I thought that'd be an interesting one. And Dan, I thought you might particularly be interested in this because of the use of this pi ratio and the way these young kids are taught to limit their own personal thoughts and feelings and simply tap into the universal field. How interesting is that?
It reminds me of that famous Sam Lentine in psychotronics math professor Rensselaer. He was born without eyeballs or eye sockets, but his mind was equations. And he focused so well on the equation for alcohol into the water, they then measured that water did turn into wine, and they knew exactly why in wave mechanics, actually. So there are examples that if you can get that clear, and in transmutation as well, that actually alchemy is only a name for non-destructive charge collapse, which is exactly the physics of human bliss. So in both cases, whether it's isotope transition or human bliss, it is non-destructive compression. So exactly when you have access to the bliss state, then you have that literally that leverage in your aura, and your aura can become immensely powerful in inertia for sure.
Bridget, you're the youngest and brightest amongst us. How optimistic are you?
It's dystopic and it's very hopeful. I love the entrainment that David was talking about in frequency, and I think that part of what lockdown and all of that taught us is the isolation does not work. I mean, it's just as destructive in different ways as the vaccine, and it's something really important to look at is that continuation of attuning in connection with each other and connecting with our heart and being in community and those pieces, and how healthy and how essential that is, especially for the children and especially for all of us. It's a need, and it keeps us in check, you know, on an energetic level, on a nervous system level, and it keeps us in check to make sure that we're not going AWOL or making crazy decisions and reaffirming our choice. So I think bringing it back to connection with ourselves, connection with each other, connection to the earth, the reconnection to what we want to connect with is an essential piece of soul. And as far as where it's going, we're choosing. I feel like there are people absolutely, definitively, even more than ever choosing a path of goodness and soul. And then there's people that aren't. And so we're going to see how that plays out But I am still hopeful. Maybe I'm naively positive, but I am still hopeful.
Naive works. That's good. My own sense of things is that the Christed mantle, so to speak, is the plasma field. It is the protection that we need, and the Daniel in the lion's den, and the yea though I walk through the valley of death, and all of that. I certainly personally feel very immunized and inured to the witchery and the bedevilment of geoengineering and all of that ghastly stuff, which all comes down to synthetic molecules. Dan, last little piece I just wanted to discuss, and it's a bit of a throwaway. The synthetic molecule, it seems to me, is the source code of the kingdom of the devil in the world today, in as much as it's the thing that is permeating the air, soil, and water biome, and the biome of every living system, and trying to convert, transmogrify from the inside out. It's pretty devilish stuff. It seems to me that the devil always had a license to creep, to tiptoe in to our temple, provided we granted some kind of permission. What permissions did we grant in allowing the invasion of synthetic molecules into all aspects of our living system?
Well, I think it's been called misqualified energy. Let's take synthetic aluminum, for example. The amperage that fuses bauxite to make aluminum is the ultimate in charge isolation, the opposite of charge distribution. And that is literally disconnection from Christos. For example, the health records of aluminum plants and the bad geokarma of aluminum plants are the worst on the planet. And you cannot take living plasma inside an aluminum box, never. So anything that isolates charge from distribution is fundamentally the definition of all pain. Now, the opposite of that, if you, again, try to define Christos, if you watched a child putting a hole in the cloud, they're dancing barefoot in the mud. So they're defining what consciousness peak is. You know, physics has agreed. Charge collapse is a cause of gravity. Charge collapse is a cause of consciousness. Charge collapse is a cause of bliss. My new book, plonkfire.com. This is a slight ad. See the preview. So it is about charge collapse. So that kid barefoot in the mud can put a hole in the cloud, the definition of Christos, to crystallize, because the centripetal force of that charge collapse is exactly what persuades the vapor to touch centripetally and form a droplet. All of Christos is actually that. So fundamentally, the bliss experience is connecting with ground, enabling charge collapse. And that's what Kundalini is. That's what bliss is. You become the center of gravity of the tornado when you identify with that charge collapse. So it is a very simple process, actually. Access to ground, human bliss, experiencing that lightning bolt of Kundalini, that golden ratio cascade of the Schumann harmonics, which define the brainwave harmonics and define the world's most powerful bliss binaural, flameinmind.com/flameinsound. It's the same perfect phase conjugate pump wave.
Okay, wonderful. Well, dancing in the mud smells like the meek inheriting the earth to me.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right, friends, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Lazarus today. And I've just brought our producer in, which is the breach of protocol because she doesn't like to be seen. But thank you, Dan. Thank you, Bridget. Thanks, Shanaz. And thank you, David. Delightful conversation.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone.
For helping.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget.
Much love. Bye now.
David.
Bye.